Viewpoints on the talk station, FM 107, AM 1240. This portion of the program is being pre-recorded to allow our guests to meet other commitments for the day, and it's a topic that I think is very important for not only our immediate region of coastal North Carolina, but actually the state of North Carolina, and then if you get even deeper as we go into this issue of energy and energy management, the country. It's a national and strategic issue wherever you might be in the world. And today we're hoping to speak with Abigail Hopper. She is the director of BOEM. And by the way, just make note of this, our guests who are listening into the program as well. We use a lot of acronyms. We'll try to, at various times throughout the program, assure everyone that we will describe the acronym Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM. It's going to become a standard word here. But today we have, in place of Director Hopper, we have Deputy Director Dr. Walter Cruickshank. Director Hopper is sick today, and I appreciate they're making allowances to accommodate our earlier commitment. And so it's a great deal of pleasure to have joining us this afternoon Deputy Director of BOEM. Again, that's Bureau Ocean Energy Management, Dr. Cruickshank. He is a Deputy Director for BOEM, which was, of course, established in 2011, and he has served as Deputy Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement, and formerly MMS, Minerals Management Service, if I'm not mistaken, for that abbreviation. And with that, Dr. Cruickshank, welcome. Thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me. And Director Hopper sends her regrets.
No, I understand, and I recognize whenever we make advanced plans of this nature, they are subject to change. So that is an understandable situation. But I want to go to something that she said, last week, as a matter of fact. She was in Raleigh, and she made some very compelling statements, and I'd like to sort of begin with those, and then we'll get into issues. And by the way, we will mention that today in Nags Head area, Kill Devil Hills to be exact, this afternoon starting at 3 o'clock and then again at 5:30, there are a series of public hearings that are being conducted by BOEM on behalf of the public. And we'll get into the details of that in a few moments. But I want to initiate this conversation, if I could, Dr. Cruickshank, with the comments that Ms. Hopper made last week in Raleigh. And one of the things that really caught my attention, and she noted here, she described North Carolina as a frontier. This is a frontier region. North Carolina is in the running for a state that requires the most attention after Alaska. Of course, we're talking about energy resources and reserves, and wow, that's a significant statement. Dr. Cruickshank, based on what background would she or BOEM make such a description, and what are we talking about when we're talking about energy management?
That statement of Director Hopper's, I think, reflects the high level of engagement that the state of North Carolina and the public of North Carolina have had in our planning processes. We've been dealing with the state government, with the congressional delegation, coastal communities have weighed in, and a lot of members of the public as well. And when she's talking about the attention we're giving to North Carolina, it's in recognition that folks in the state are engaged in this process as we want them to be. And because of that, we are fully engaged with the state as well.
But is she talking about actual energy resources? Because she mentions wind and oil and gas, and of course, she specifically states that fact, that wind is a significant potential here along the coast. That, in fact, Hopper also noted that barring offshore drilling closer than 50 nautical miles, and we're going to get into the issue of buffer, one of the reasons we proposed a 50-mile buffer is to allow an area for renewable energy. And she pretty much describes North Carolina as a significant player in wind energy in relationship to the other southeastern states. So is there some calculus, is there some metric that indicates that North Carolina's resources, both oil, fossil fuel resources, as well as wind resources, make us unique among the other states along the eastern seaboard?
Well, North Carolina has a great deal of potential off its coast for both conventional energy and renewable energy, particularly offshore wind. The comparison to other states is, I think, in part looking at the fact that North Carolina has a pretty long coastline, and because of the shape of the coast there, it also has a lot of strong winds, and I think that it does make North Carolina focal point for some of the discussions that is going on. Certainly for oil and gas in the mid and South Atlantic region, We don't know a whole lot about the resources yet. We have estimates of what we think might be out there, but until there's some additional exploration, we're not really going to have a good handle on just how much there is and where it might be.
And speaking of that, of course, I know that North Carolina Division of Coastal Management just recently approved or accepted seismic testing under the auspices of consistency. All right, continuing on with this conversation, and again, I want to thank our guest, Dr. Walter Cruickshank. He is the Deputy Director of BOEM, that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We're talking with him about comments made last week by the director herself, Abigail Hopper, in Raleigh. Let's talk about this issue of the resources that you know are out there. It's been quite some time since any surveying was done. As a matter of fact, it was 1980s, I remember. And I know that in one instance, Chevron was one of the leaseholders. What do we know about what we've got out there? And again, going back to Director Hopper's remarks, which were significant, is there enough indication that we have enough resources off the coast of North Carolina or just off the East Coast, and I want to get into that as well, to warrant this kind of recognition?
We think the area has significant potential for oil and gas. The data that we have directly on the area, as you noted, dates from the 1970s and 1980s, and the seismic technologies have really improved dramatically since then in terms of being able to get clearer pictures of what lies beneath the seabed and to do so at greater depths. The other sort of new information that we've had since then is the development of oil and gas offshore Canada, off the coast of Africa, that provide geologic analogs for what we would expect to find off the coast of the mid and South Atlantic in the United States. And so that information as well makes us believe that there is significant potential for oil and gas.
All right, and of course, the purpose of all these public hearings. One quick question before I get into those public hearings. Governor McCrory, of course, himself has expressed desire to reduce the buffer, and yet, again, Director Hopper mentioned that one of the reasons for the buffer, the 50-mile buffer, which is apparently unique only to the eastern seaboard from Delaware to Florida. And also, just to make a quick note, of course, this was a request at Governor Terry McAuliffe's desires, former governor of Virginia. He is promoting this as basically a concern for military and commercial shipping purposes, as well as offshore wind. Again, North Carolina is interested in removing that 50-mile buffer. What are the potentials? And, of course, as I mentioned, Director Hopper said that it allowed for the coexistence of the two energy forms, fossil fuel development, oil, gas, and wind. And my question also goes to, is there a concern that those two forms of energy development can't coexist within a visual range?
We don't believe the two forms of energy are mutually exclusive. We believe that the wind development is going to be closer to shore initially, and we believe that both types of energy development can occur without one blocking the other from occurring. The 50-mile buffer is informed really by a lot of information. Part of it, as you noted, is the request from the governor of Virginia, the fact that there are a lot of other activities in that area, Department of Defense, NASA, commercial fishing, navigation. And there's also environmental issues related to marine mammals, sea turtles, and fishery habitat. So there are a lot of things that were considered in deciding to use a 50-mile buffer. Now, with respect to changing that buffer, we cannot bring it closer to shore in this 5-year program planning process without going back to a previous step and really starting again. We can reduce the size of the area being considered for a lease sale, but we cannot expand it without reinitiating the program planning process.
All right, our guest again, just to remind everyone, is Dr. Walter Cruickshank, Deputy Director of BOEM, that's the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. She's joining us this afternoon. We're pre-recording this program in advance to a public hearing that's taking place later today in Kill Devil Hills, and we'll give you details on that in a moment. Dr. Cruickshank, back to the topic of the administration. You mentioned that a moment ago, and the administration has said that they basically would like to wrap this up in the next 5-year leasing plan. I assume in advance of the president leaving office. Is there an effort to accelerate this? Is there some concern? And what is the assurances that the work being done now will actually see fruition or fact some form of conclusion, because if I'm not mistaken, the first lease doesn't happen until 2021. Am I correct on that?
Yes, and there's a couple points to make here, Lockwood. First, we're in the midst of a planning process for the next 5-year program that starts in 2017 and runs through 2022. And what we're talking about now are areas where we're trying to get public input, gather additional information to inform decisions that will be made in the future about whether or not these areas will be included in that next 5-year program. So we don't have final decisions yet. All we're doing is we've identified areas we want more information on, and we're in that information gathering stage. With respect to the fact that the proposal includes a sale off the Atlantic coast late in that 5-year program, that reflects that we would have a lot of work to do to prepare for that sale. We haven't been active for oil and gas off the Atlantic in quite some time, so there are environmental analyses that will need to occur, consultations with the state, with resource management agencies. And if we're going to hold a sale here, we want to make sure we do it right. And so putting it late in the program allows us the time to go through all those steps to make sound decisions.
All right. So in some regards, if I'm going to paraphrase some conclusions I've made here, that in essence, while North Carolina is perceived as one of many, well, Delaware to Florida, potential wind and fossil fuel energy resources, I'm understanding that, in essence, the director is really looking more at the actual public engagement of our efforts rather than necessarily the technical services and supplies. In other words, that North Carolina does not stand out like a thumb. At first, I thought it did when I was reading her story.
No, I think North Carolina stands out in the sense that it has a lot of resource potential, and it also stands out in the level of engagement that we've been seeing from the public. And again, we encourage that sort of input because we want good information on which to base our decisions. Okay,
I want to go back to wind and oil, the two disparate forms of energy here on the coast. And you mentioned, of course, obviously the issue of oil gas leases, yet the state and the federal government are pretty much on fast track, I'll use that description, with wind energy. And I know that recently there were plans for 2 test wind turbines in northeastern North Carolina, right there at the border of Virginia. They have since backed off last week, as a matter of fact, on the grounds that it was too expensive. Is there still an effort on the part of BOEM and the administration to promote wind energy, wind turbines, and is that in concert with or apart from this conversation related to oil and gas off the coast?
We are very supportive of an offshore wind program, and we're doing what we can to help that industry get started off the coast of the U.S. The process for offshore wind is a different planning process than for oil and gas. We've been engaged with an interagency task force in the state of North Carolina with state agencies, local governments, other federal agencies to try and identify areas that are suitable for wind and which reduce the level of conflict. And we're pretty far along in that planning process. As a matter of fact, some areas that we think meet those criteria have been put out for public comment some time ago, and we're working with the task force to try and move that process forward.
All right. One quick question before we wrap things up with the comment about today's public hearing that's taking place in Kill Devil Hills. And again, Dr. Walter Cruickshank. And Dr. Cruickshank, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon. Deputy Director of BOEM, that's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. The topic goes to the issue of wind energy and, if you will, oil exploration, gas potential. Obviously, we're looking at the the extended portion of that product, the actual development of these gas fields, oil gas fields, and also wind fields. The next question, of course, the most important one, is transferring what we discover or utilize or extract in the case of oil or gas, in the case of wind, getting it from that point of extraction and use to the shore. What about that in relationship to both the environmental concerns and also the infrastructure development necessary? Where are we in that process? Is that something that BOEM is concerned with? Has BOEM, in fact, been working with state and federal and private entities to sort of deal with those challenges?
That's a major issue, Lockwood, and we certainly consider the impacts that the onshore infrastructure would have as we conduct our environmental impact analyses and try to understand what the consequences are of moving forward with the program. Now, where the onshore infrastructure is not something that we have a direct role in within our Bureau. That infrastructure is largely going to be permitted by state and local agencies, since it will be onshore. And where exactly it will be will probably depend a great deal on if and where oil and gas are discovered or where wind farms are built. But there's certainly a lot of potential for economic activity that comes along with wind farms or with oil and gas development through the development of onshore infrastructure to support those industries.
All right, our guest, and I thank him for being with us, Dr. Walter Cruickshank, Deputy Director of BOEM. Dr. Cruickshank, let's look at the public hearing that's being conducted today. Is this the final hearing that BOEM will be conducting in North Carolina, and are there other public hearings that will be conducted from Florida to Delaware?
These hearings today are on the geological and geophysical permits that we're considering for the seismic activities off the coast, and the meetings in Kill Devil Hills today are the last in this set of hearings around those permits. We will be having additional public hearings in the future as the next 5-year program is put together. We've had some already, as you know, and they were extremely well attended in North Carolina. But when we get to the next proposal, along with the draft environmental impact statement that goes along with that proposal, we'll be having additional public meetings at that point as well.
Now, this concludes this. When will we have a conclusion from BOEM, and or what next?
There are different next steps depending on exactly what we're talking about. For development of the next 5-year program, we are considering all the input we've received. We'll be developing a draft environmental impact statement. The administration will decide whether it wants to make any modifications to the proposal that was put out recently in the next proposal that we put out, and we'll continue with the public process around developing that program. For the geological and geophysical permits, we are underway with our analyses of those individual permits. We'll be considering all the input we get at the public meeting today. And other agencies are looking at those as well. As you noted earlier, the state coastal zone agencies, as well as National Marine Fisheries Service over protection for endangered species and marine mammals. And as we work through that process, the next step would be a decision on whether or not to grant the permit, and if so, with what conditions. And then for offshore wind, as I said, we're well along in that planning process. Our next step will be to continue to engage the public with a more detailed proposal of where we may offer those leases.
A question for you on the offshore leases for gas and oil. Is there a deadline at which point you will be making that announcement?
Our goal in developing this 5-year program is to have that proposed final program, which is the third of the 3 proposals that we put out, in place by early 2017. As you know, the current 5-year program expires in 2017, and we want to make sure we have the next one in place well before it expires.
All right. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Dr. Walter Cruickshank, and Deputy Director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We avoided a lot of acronyms. I want to thank you for that, and I look forward to future conversations with you, sir.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Viewpoints on the Talk Station, FM 107, AM 1240.